For this week's video, we're going to go over 3 separate coiling and weaving techniques that I use to create depth and texture to my pieces. For the first weave, I have 2 4-inch pieces of 21 gauge square and 1 piece of 16 gauge half round. I've clamped them so it's a 21 gauge square on either side of the 16 gauge half round. I'm going to begin this weave with 28 gauge round. To start, I'm just going to wrap the 28 gauge once around one of my squares. Slide it down to the bottom. From here, I'm going to take it under the half round and then over the square. Wrap once around the square and repeat the same process, going under the half round, over the square, once around the other side. One more time. A few things to keep in mind as you're working on this weave is that every time that you finish with the square, this round wire should be coming up and over the square to the outside from both directions. Keeping an eye on that will let you know if you made a mistake anywhere within the weave. As you're weaving, the center wire develops these cool parallel lines running across it. This could be attached to the piece with the flat side up to give it a rectangle wire look, or flipped over with the half round faced up, depending on the texture you're going for. These parallel lines could easily be more spaced out by adding an extra coil around either of the square wires on either side. To keep the lines running straight, coil the same amount of times on either square. To bend the weave, coil 1 or 2 times more on one side than you would on the other. When you reach the desired length for the weave, you can take your nylon tipped pliers and flatten it just to make sure that everything sits nice and flush. This next weave is a variation really similar to that same one. So I again have 2 pieces of 21 gauge square and 1 piece of 16 gauge half round. I've started the weave the same way, where I have a square clamped on either side of the 16 gauge half round and wrapped around the bottom square once. Now to start this weave, I'm going to go down in between the square and the half round again. But this time, instead of coming back up between the right square and the half round, I'm going to go all the way to the other side and wrap once around the square. And to go back, straight across the top of the half round into that same gap we started with at the beginning. Wrap once around that square and repeat the same process. As we're working on this weave, it'll create 2 separate sections. One with the square and the half round paired together, and one with the square separate. I usually like to use this technique when I'm going to taper the weave off, and later on connect these two with this one curled away. When you reach the desired length in the same way, I'm going to take my nylon tips and flatten everything to make sure it sits nice and flush. The finished weave almost looks like a coil running next to a wider coil. For our last coil structure, I have 3 pieces of 21 gauge square and 2 pieces of 18 gauge half round. To start, I've taken my 28 gauge round and I've wrapped once around one of the squares to make sure that I've locked the ending. And I'm going to go ahead and coil 10 times around my squares before adding my half rounds to the coil. Before doing so, I'm going to take my nylon tips and flatten my 28 and then add the 18 gauge to the clamp. I'm going to take both pieces of 18 gauge with the flat side down on top of the coil where they can sit right next to each other and actually cover up almost the entire surface area of the 3 pieces of 21 gauge. From here, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it around 3 times. And replace them in the clamp. From here, I can take my nylon tips just to make sure everything is sitting flush before bending my 18 gauges 90 degrees. From here, I can continue to coil with the 28 gauge. I like to keep the two 18 gauges together, but you could actually vary them where you wrapped around one 18 gauge down and one up to create a cool crisscrossing pattern on the top of your weave. I like to keep them parallel, so I'm going to do that for now. I've wrapped around the squares 10 times, and I'm going to come back to these 18 gauge 3 full rotations before repeating the same process, where I flatten with my nylon tips, bend them all straight back up, and coil around my squares again. I can repeat this same process for the length that I desire for the pattern to be. Creating variation in this is super easy. This next time I'm actually going to coil triple the amount of times I've been doing on the square and do 30 around this before reconnecting my 18 to it. Increasing the distance between the connections of the 18 gauge to the coil structure gives a little bit more flexibility to this point. I'm actually going to use this coil as part of a bail in a later piece, and this is exactly where I want it to be able to bend all the way over from the back to the front of the piece. For more behind the scenes looks into my work, check out my Instagram page. Or to see what I have available for sale, check out my website. The link for both is in the description below. If you liked this video or found it helpful, go ahead and like and subscribe to my channel for more content similar in the future. If you're interested in supporting what I do here on this channel, check out my Patreon. The link is in the description below. I want to give a special thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel: Ben, Bevan, Cheyenne, Dawn B, Dawn N, Diane, Earthstar Creations, Isaac, It's Just Tricky, Janine, Jerry, Nancy, Pearly Baker, Susan K, Susan L, and Vondal McKnight.